Hi guys, in this tutorial I will explain how you can create water effects like the one you see on screen in Maya LT without using an ocean shader or fluid effects or particle effects. Before we begin, there are a few things I would like to mention. I will be using Maya LT 2016, so if you're following along and you cannot find some of the options you see on screen, it's probably because you're using an older version. Also, this is not a tutorial for absolute beginners. To follow the explanations properly, you will need basic understanding of how Maya works. And finally, since Maya LT is intended for video games, the end result is something you can import in a game engine and it will give you a fairly believable effect. This will be a two-part tutorial. In the first part, we'll set up a scene in Maya LT from which we'll generate normal and displacement maps. And in the second part, we will see how we can get tiling maps from non-tiling textures and how to create a simple water shader. Okay, so let's begin. Let's create a new scene. What we're going to do is create a very dense mesh and deform its surface to look like waves, and then bake normal and displacement maps which we can use in a game engine. Once we have those maps, there are two ways in which we can animate water. We can use one tileable texture, which we can repeat across the surface of a low-res geometry in-game to give the illusion of waves. Or instead of using one texture, we can use an image sequence, which is animated and it loops to achieve the same effect. The first method of using just one map um, is very advantageous because we're not going to use too much memory. We only have one texture and it's going to use way less memory than using a whole image sequence. Okay, so let's create a polygon plane and let's make it a bit bigger and also give it a bit more detail. Let's say 300 by 300, and as you can see, this mesh is very dense. So even if we deform the surface to look like waterways, we cannot import this into a game engine and have a good performance. We are going to deform the surface using a fractal texture which controls a texture deformer. So let's select the mesh, go into the modeling menu, and then deform texture. Reset the settings. The default settings are okay. Let's open up the attribute editor and connect the fractal into this attribute right here, to texture. And as you can see, the surface is already deformed. And now let's play around with the attributes of the fractal. And by the way, take these numbers that you're going to see on screen as a starting point. The more you play with these attributes and the more time you spend tweaking on it, the better it will look. The amplitude we're going to use to control the overall height of the waves. Let's decrease the ratio a bit. And if we want to generate a tileable texture directly from Maya, this attribute right here, the frequency ratio, if we look in the documentation, it says if this ratio is not a whole integer, then the fractal does not repeat at the UV boundaries. Which basically means if we want to generate a tileable normal and displacement map, this attribute right here needs to be an integer number. In the second part of the tutorial, we'll see how we can generate tileable maps even if our texture does not tile. So don't worry too much about this. The attribute which will make the surface look like waves is this one right here. It's called inflection. And speaking of which, if you notice, right now the surface does not look very much like water. It looks like very puffy clouds. This is because the deformer right now is pointing up. All we need to do is select it and rotate it so this arrow points down. So let's rotate in X 180 degrees, and already the surface starts to look like waves. The bias will, if we increase this attribute, it will give you more wave peaking. And let's decrease the amplitude. It all depends on what kind of water you're trying to generate. But if this is something that looks good to you, you can just skip to generating the maps and you'll be done. However, let's see what we can do to generate maps which do not tile. So remember this attribute right here, the frequency ratio, needs to be not an integer. For a value of 2, this surface has too much detail for my taste. For a value of 1, it doesn't have enough, so let's go somewhere in the middle and say 1.5. To make sure the texture will not tile at all, let's also decrease the coverage of the texture on the surface. Let's say half of it, 0.5 in U and 0.5 in V. Back to the fractal, increase the amplitude, and this starts to look more like a ocean. Not exactly during a storm, but not very calm either. So let's say this is good. We call this good. Oh, one more thing. If we want to generate an image sequence, we need to enable this checkbox right here. And if we play with time attribute, you can see the texture animates over time. However, this is not what we're going to do right now. But even if we're not trying to generate an image sequence, it's a good idea to enable this checkbox right here and play with the time attribute until you get a frame which you like. Let's say this is good. So right now we need to generate our maps. We're going to use another plane, this time very low res. Let's give it the same size. It was 50 by 50. And we only need one polygon. Let's decrease this to 1 by 1. Let's move it just a bit above the first plane just to make sure there's no interpenetration so the maps are baked correctly. And let's go to the shading module, texture baking, and turtle texture baking. We want to bake, not preview. Increase the min and max samples to 0 and 2 just to get a better quality. We don't care about global illumination and environment right now. So let's switch directly to baking. We're going to bake to a texture, not to vertices. For the target, let's select the low resolution plane and add it as a target, and the high resolution plane and add it as a source. The transfer settings are fine for now. The texture bake settings. This is the resolution of the final textures, which is fine for our purpose. And they were going to be placed in this directory right here in your project directory. Let's give them a name. Just modify this. Baked. We don't care about the shape name. Targa is fine as a image format. Let's go to outputs. We don't want any sort of shaded outputs. We do want, however, a normal map and a displacement map, and the defaults are fine for now. So let's go to texture baking and bake. And as you can see, this is what we get. This is the normal map, and just a bit before you saw the displacement map. Let's try to open it. Turtle, bake texture, displacement. And we are pretty much done. Um, so in this tutorial we saw how we can generate normal and displacement map from a high resolution mesh. And later in a second part of the tutorial we will see how we can make the texture to tile and how to create a very simple water shader. Thank you for watching, and please join me in the second part of the tutorial.